Welcome, everybody. It's so lovely to see the auditorium here at the Charles Perkins Centre full, or approaching full, but it's more than that. It's virtually overfull. We have at least double the number of you in the room, also online, which is interesting in relation to an evening about loneliness. So, before we begin, there's a little bit of housekeeping we need to go through. Three things. The first is that live captioning is available. Details are up on the screen for how you access this on your own device. Secondly, please be aware that the event will be filmed. Be mindful of making noise, and please do switch off your phones. And you'll see cameras, and I hope they're not going to be too intrusive. And thirdly, there's going to be an opportunity to ask questions in the second part of the hour, and to do so, we're going to be using the Slido application. And so if you're preparing yourself for submitting questions, head to Slido, which is SLIDO.com, and enter the code Sydney Ideas, and away you go. And again, before we commence, I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land upon which we're meeting. That's the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Respects to elders past, present and emerging, and a very warm welcome and acknowledgement to First Australians in the audience. Famously socially connected, and therein lies the topic of this evening. The topic of this evening is the loneliness epidemic, and it's part of the Sydney Ideas series, which is Sydney's preeminent public forum for discussion. I'm Steve Simpson. I'm the academic director of the Charles Perkins Centre, and you're in the auditorium of the Charles Perkins Centre. So this evening, we're going to be talking about loneliness, and the Charles Perkins Centre's mission is to ease the burden of chronic disease, as that relates to conditions such as obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease and related conditions, which may leave you wondering, why are we concerned about loneliness? Well, the answer to that is actually quite simple, and that relates to the fact that we humans are a fantastically social species. We're social animals, and that tendency to group together, to work together socially, is the root to our success as a species, and it's deeply embedded in our biology, and that means that it's related profoundly to our physical and our mental health. So loneliness is the antithesis of social connectedness, and hence it's no surprise that it's linked to poor physical and mental health. And that really is what we're considering this evening. In fact, there's considered to be such an epidemic of loneliness at the moment that the US Surgeon General warned that it is an epidemic, and that loneliness has to be, and I quote here, a health priority on par with tobacco and obesity. But that's not only in the US, of course. The evidence is strong that the same issues are facing us here in Australia. So we have across the University of Sydney some really brilliant researchers who are working in the area of loneliness, what it is, how it impacts our health, what we can do about it. And we're really lucky to have three of them here this evening. So you're going to hear, to begin the evening, a talk from Associate Professor Melody Ding, who's sitting here in the front, and I'll introduce Melody to you in a moment. Also from We're going to have then a discussion after she's presented for about 20 minutes or so. We'll sit down and introduce two other guests this evening. We've got Dr. Jennifer Kent with us and Daniel Surkalim. They'll join Melody and me on the stage. We'll engage in a discussion with one another, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So that's how we're going to make the evening work. But first, I'm going to introduce Melody. Melody is one of our brilliant and star recruits to the Charles Perkins Centre, the School of Public Health here at the University of Sydney, and she's a really prominent member of the Prevention Research Centre, which are located in the School of Public Health and in the Charles Perkins Centre. Melody's an epidemiologist, population behavioural scientist, and she's really interested in the interaction between physical activity, lifestyle, built environment, how things work as a system in society to support or otherwise mental and physical health and well-being. She's passionate and committed to improving population health, and you're going to hear a little bit about some of her work here, but especially she's turned her attention to the issue of loneliness recently. And she's going to tell us about that work, the impacts that loneliness has on other aspects of well-being. So she'll take us through a talk, which we think is around 20 minutes. Melody informed me that she thinks loosely about time, so we're going to have something really remarkable and exciting, I'm sure, and we'll drag her off the stage if need be after 20 minutes. But it's such a pleasure, Melody. We're incredibly proud of you and glad that you're with us and looking forward to your talk. So I'll ask you to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steve, for the wonderful introduction. And thank you all for being here, my friends and colleagues and fellow humans, especially on the night when the Matildas are playing. Thank you for giving me the time. You will still have time for the match after. I'll keep that in mind when it comes to keeping my time. So, as Steve introduced, I'm an epidemiologist. I use large data sets to understand risk profiles and predictors of disease and health outcomes, because I have a mission to make everybody live long and healthy. And for the most part of my career, I've been working with physical activity, sedentary behavior, and diet, those behaviors that we can observe and measure. About 7 years ago, I was working with some Norwegian data sets to try to find some predictive algorithms for early death. And there's one question, one variable that really stood out. Independent of all the other known traditional risk factors, it seems to be highly correlated with early death. The question went, do you regularly participate in social activities, such as political associations or sewing clubs? Sewing clubs, yeah, that was my reaction. I laughed, did the analysis, wrote up the results, published the paper without really understand deeply and personally what that question was about. So as all the good postdocs are supposed to do, I published the paper. I didn't touch or even think about sewing clubs for years to come. Fast forward a couple of years, I was approached by an intelligent and enthusiastic young man, Daniel. You will meet him, so hold your excitement. Daniel wanted to do a PhD on loneliness. And to be honest, I had never really thought too much about loneliness up until then. But after a really intellectually engaging conversation with Daniel, I went back home and I spent the whole evening thinking and reading. I got so fascinated by this topic, particularly because it brought me back to some memories that I was trying so hard to hide. It brought me back to the time that I was the only international student in the master's and my PhD program back in the United States. My family in China, thousands of miles away, and I was struggling to find my own identity. I tried hard to look American, sound American, act like American, so that I could be accepted as an American. And especially as some 20-something-year-old introverted nerd who has a very low tolerance of alcohol and parties, it was very hard for me. I tried to socialize by the American playbook, but all I remember was this serious anxiety built up days before even going to the party. And I remember being at a party, trying so hard to hold a conversation about small talks I just didn't care a thing about. And the whole time I feel like there was a spotlight shining on top of me, really magnifying every little awkwardness in my voice and in my movement. And after I came home, I'll be exhausted for days, microanalyzing everything I said and trying to draw causal links between every minor things I said and the tiny little shift of facial expressions or body language in my conversation partner. That was my life for years. I was hypervigilant. I was hypersensitive. I was withdrawn sometimes, but now I have the language for how I felt. I was lonely. I got so interested in this question, and I accepted Daniel as my PhD student, and we started this loneliness journey together. In the first year, we learned so much together and so much from each other. But in the meantime, the little virus has shocked the world and changed the way we live. Overnight, we were forced to live our life differently. We're forced to have a conversation on screen, on Zoom, instead of in person. We're forced to airwave instead of hug and hide our smiles behind our face masks. If there's anything that I can say as a silver lining of COVID, that is the fact that it taught us how important social connections are. All of a sudden, collectively, we know what it feels like to be lonely, and we start to talk about loneliness. You have to look quite far not to see headlines in the last couple of years linking loneliness to any of these outcomes you have seen here. And as Steve mentioned, even the Surgeon General has now paid full attention to loneliness as an important health and social issues. So we know that loneliness has important mental, physical, and cognitive outcomes. But beyond all of these scary things that you see on the screen, loneliness is a social epidemic. Lonely individuals make lonely societies, and socially disconnected communities tend to have less trust, less resilience, less social capitals, and they feel less safe. So we need to start to talk about this as a social epidemic. I don't think I should be talking about loneliness all by myself, right? That's not your expectation when you walk into the room today. So there will be some interactions, and this will be the first audience interaction. It's a pulse check in the room. So I invite you to raise your hand if you have ever felt lonely. And keep your hands up if you felt lonely at some point last year. Thank you so much for your honesty, and congratulations for being human. Loneliness is such a common, if not universal, experience. It is that Saturday night blues when we're spending weekends alone, wishing that we had someone else to share the weekend with. It's the feeling that we wish we had known more people when we moved to a new city. So we have all experienced that at some point in our life. So before I'm going to define what loneliness is, I want to talk about what loneliness isn't. Loneliness is not a pathology. It's not an illness that needs to be cured or fixed. Loneliness is such a common experience. It's a feeling that all of us have as humans. Because we're social species, the sense of loneliness is imprinted in our DNA so that when we're alone for too long, it's a signal for us to reach out for fellow human beings because we survive so much better as a group together. It has been compared to hunger when we reach out for food and thirst when we reach out for water. But it's important to keep in mind that there's a distinction between feeling lonely every now and then, as I mentioned earlier, which is what we called academic jargon, episodic loneliness, versus feeling lonely for an extended period of time or all the time, which is what we call chronic loneliness. And all these illnesses that you see here, all the health problems, tend to be associated with a chronic loneliness, which what we consider as problematic. So, the next audience participation question, true or false? Loneliness affects 1 in 3 in the world. If you think it's true, please raise your hand. All right. Okay, of course, as an academic, I'll give you a very long-winded answer. So we first saw the statistics first appear in a 2018 Lancet editorial calling attention to loneliness as a social epidemic. And in the early journey of our research, we saw this number, but we actually couldn't find the data where the number was based on. Because as public health researchers, we really care about, first defining how widespread a problem is. So when we couldn't really find the source of the data, we decided to go find the data ourselves. So for 2 years of painstaking and lonely process, a lot of the time during lockdown, we systematically reviewed all the loneliness estimates at the population level from any countries that we can find in the world, and we meta-analyzed these findings. So I'm just going to quickly show it to you here. So part of the exercise made us realize that there's really an inequality issue when we start to talk about loneliness. Because while there are regions like Europe that we're blessed with such a plethora of data, there's a lot of low and middle income countries that we know very little about. So that's our first observation. Then when we're talking about prevalence in a region like Europe, we see huge differences. The first observation is, well, it looks like loneliness seems to be an experience that we feel differently at different stages of our life, and particularly in Europe, what it really stood out is the older age, that loneliness is much higher, so that seems to be the case across different sub-regions within Europe. But the one thing that really fascinated me is when you start to look at areas like Northern Europe as compared with Eastern Europe, across all age group, what we're seeing is about 3 to 4 times difference when it comes to loneliness prevalence. These countries are very different in many ways: economic status, socio-demographic characteristic, culture, inequality, social safety net, and welfare system. So all of these together contributed to this vast difference that we see from data from Europe. So I guess collectively we can never say that 1 in 5 or 1 in 7 of us suffers from chronic loneliness, because it really depends on where you are, because loneliness is a social epidemic. Next true or false question. Loneliness has significantly increased over time. Raise your hand if you think that's the case. Great. Thank you so much for participating. So, in terms of loneliness, that's, to me, an obvious place to go, when we think about how our life has changed so dramatically in the last few decades. Possibly more so than ever, we have a large proportion of the population living alone, families are getting smaller, and the role that community organizations play, such as churches, has been diminishing over time. We hardly know our neighbors anymore, and we changed our way of communicating with each other. So, a lot of us think that loneliness must have increased over time as a health issue. And this has been the case when it comes to the time we spend with each other, at least based on the US data. When researchers analyzed time use data over the last few decades, it occurred that more so than ever before, we spent time alone. But have we felt more lonely than ever? So, again, as a scientist, we really want the data to answer the question. So Daniel and I, together with our colleagues, we look into population representative data from the US. And what we found really surprised us. It looks like that in the US, at least in the older age group, loneliness has actually decreased over time, and that's the case both for episodic loneliness and for prolonged loneliness. But as scientists, we're always looking for caveats, and I think there's a couple of caveats there. First, even though our finding has been replicated by other studies as well, it is important to acknowledge that because loneliness has been quite a new concept that researchers are interested in, we haven't been measuring loneliness for that long. So at most 20 years, but we can't really have longer-term data for us to really play with a long-term trend. So that is a limitation, and hopefully, as time goes on, we can start to monitor that better. For another, because loneliness is such a subjective feeling, it is defined as the discrepancy between your ideal social relationship and the one you currently have. That is likely to be different over time because of the discourse in the society about loneliness, because of our culture, because of our expectation about what social relationships are like over time. So it is very likely that over the last 20 years, while we were analyzing the data, the definition of loneliness has changed, and therefore the response was not in the same direction as we anticipated. So, next question. True or false if you think that some people are more prone to loneliness than others? Thank you. Again, I'll give you a complicated response. Michelle Lim et al. In 2020, in their landmark paper, has defined loneliness as the consequence of risk factors interacting with triggers. So first, let me explain what triggers are. So triggers could be an individual experience, like losing a job or losing an intimate relationship. Or it could be collective, like what we all went through in the last 3 years with repeated lockdowns and restrictions. Risk factors, if you look into the literature, it seems to be quite consistent. So there are certain groups of our population that has appeared over and over again as lonely. So some age groups, as you have seen with the slides earlier, and sociodemographic characteristic particularly associated with disadvantages. For example, low socioeconomic status, not working, living alone, being from a racial or ethnic minority, or being from the LGBTQI+ community, having chronic disease, having disabilities, the list goes on. As public health researchers, we love talking about risk factors because this is a way for us to identify who, as members of our society, requires more care, requires more resources and attention. With the public health hat on, I think that is the right approach. But as someone with a lived experience, I do have 3 personal reflections that I want to share with you. They're very personal, and I hope to use that to challenge the way we think about the risk factors for loneliness. Number one, when we talk about who are at risk, perhaps our understanding has been limited by our presumptions about who are at risk or our inability to measure our human feeling and experience accurately. So I'm going to elaborate a little bit here. I'll give you an example about age. Because when you go into literature, it often talks about, loneliness. The young and the old, they tend to be the ones who are at risk. Adolescents, young adults, going through transitions in their life, moving through new environment and new challenges, struggling with self-identity, that is a really vulnerable age for loneliness. I agree. And similarly, for older adults, we tend to think about, well, they've also gone through important challenges in their life, and they might be empty nesters, they might have just retired or lost their spouse. So that is a very vulnerable time. But when Daniel and I were looking into the data, it doesn't seem to always add up. First, somehow, because we assume that the middle-aged adults are doing well because they tend to be married, in a good job, busy with their life, having a successful career and raising children, they must not be lonely. But we actually don't have the data to say that. In a very small number of countries where there are data, it doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like they're just as equally at risk as other age groups. So perhaps our presumptions about who is at risk has reinforced what we identify as risk factors. I'll give you another example. We often see in the literature that women tend to be more at risk of loneliness when compared with men, and the data really seems to stack up that way. But these data tend to come from studies that ask directly, have you ever felt lonely, like what I did at the beginning of the talk? But if you start to ask indirectly, like, are you happy with your social relationships? Can you easily confide with people? These are actually the more preferred question to capture loneliness. And when we start to ask that way, it looks like men are at least equally at risk. So somehow women are more in tune with their feeling of loneliness and label it as lonely, or being more willing to accept that they're lonely. And this is not just a gender issue. If we can see such a distinction here, then we suspect that in subgroup of our societies where they feel more stigmatized to acknowledge that they're lonely, then we might actually not be measuring their loneliness properly. And my second reflection is, when we talk about risk factor, we talk about who are at risk. But a lot of these risk factors are actually dynamic through our lifestyle. Thinking about having a job versus not having a job, being in a relationship versus not being in a relationship, having illness or disability versus not. Any of these, we can slip into that category at any point in our life. So it is something that is probably more about when rather than who. I think it's important to acknowledge that because it takes away our feelings of us versus them, we're at risk, you're not, and vice versa, because we're all united in our shared vulnerability to loneliness. And I have my third reflection. When we talk about risk factors, we tend to label the individuals. But loneliness is a social epidemic, as I just described, and it has a lot to do with how we build a society inclusively. All aspects of our environment, our social environment, our physical environment, our information environment, and how that make us feel as individuals within the environment. Give you an example. I have been following the literature in ableism and ageism, and what I really like their frame of thinking is that we used to think that ageism tend to be more about the individual, but now we start to change the conversation into thinking that in an ideal environment, if a city, a society is built for all ages, you shouldn't feel limited by your age at all. You shouldn't feel limited by disability at all. Could we perhaps apply the same to loneliness? Could it be that the way that we value social connection, the way we make social connections, the way that we make ourselves feel accepted by the society can be hindered or facilitated by the environment that we live in? And I often think about my own personal experience back in the days when I was in the States. If I didn't live in such a car-dependent society where I have to drive from A to B and not see a human face on the whole way, if the society had more trust and less social division, if, as someone who studied in Southern California, didn't buy into this Hollywood culture where being popular or being socially accepted means that I have to be white, beautiful, wealthy, at least with wealthy parents, extroverted, would my experience be different? So, again, I just want all of us to think about loneliness as a social epidemic rather than the problem for the individual. So these are 3 interesting angles that we have been looking at loneliness. Some of the findings might surprise you, others might not. But before we end the talk today, I do want all of us to have some collective reflection as what we should do moving forward. First, as researchers, we have been so meticulous about how we measure every single nutrient and food ingredients on our plate. And for someone like me, I have been so obsessed about measuring every single minute of an intensity of physical activity that we do. But perhaps we forgot to ask who we have that dinner with and who we exercise with. The WHO defined health not as an absence of illness, but as a holistic well-being defined as physical, mental, and social health. Somehow, social health has been in my and many researchers' blind spot. Perhaps this is the time for us to bring it back. Second, as individuals, we now know what loneliness feels like, and we understand that loneliness can be different at different stages in our life, and it could be different for one person as compared with the other person. And I hope that that commonality that we share will destigmatize our conversation about loneliness, to give us less judgment and more compassion towards ourselves and towards each other. And I also hope that coming out of the pandemic for all of us, we learn to reorient what are the important things in life. We get so caught up in this constant cycle of production and consumption, whether that's producing more papers, bringing more income, earning more respect. But what are we doing this for if we don't have anywhere to share time with? So the same way as we schedule time for our exercise routines, for a doctor's appointment, could we do the same about our social relationships and make sure that we don't forget that we're human beings and a social species? Finally, as a society together, I think it's really important for us to stop and think and constantly rethink about how we can build this environment that facilitates a feeling of belongings and make, especially for the vulnerables, think about our built environment, social environment, information environment, and wherever you are, the space around you. and be kind to each other, be understanding to each other and to ourselves. Because, as we know, loneliness might come and go in our lives, and all of us have that feeling. You might be interested in how my story went, and I'm going to tell you the part 2 of my story. So, in my time in the US, it took some very special, beautiful souls for me to feel connected, but I had a very small number of friends. There are the very few people who took an interest in my culture and who I am, which is very different from the majority of the people around me. And about 10.5 years ago, I moved to Australia, and my lifestyle is completely different. Instead of driving everywhere, I cycle and I take public transport. I have opportunities and the time to smile at strangers without feeling weird. And I've found a strong sense of belonging to the scientific communities through all the colleagues and collaborators here and around the world. I have a beautiful team, some of them are here, that we feel like a family together. And I'm connected to women in STEM, in the future leaders of scientific research, a lovely group of women that make me feel like no matter where I am, I'm a part of the gang. And even the icing on cake is that I found my sewing club, even through creative pursuit. Some of them are here today, a lovely group of enthusiastic amateur dancers that we spend our creative time together, and really, you can find us any street in random times performing to the public and sharing our very deep vulnerability together. So this is my story of loneliness. What is your story like? Thank you.
Thank you, Melody. Thank you, Melody. I'm so pleased the Sewing Club came in at the end there. We're now going to have our 2 wonderful helpers carrying chairs, and that's going to give us an opportunity, Melody and I, to sit down and to invite Jennifer and Daniel to join us. And let me do that while these chairs are coming over. I'll introduce you. Jennifer Kent she's at the Senior Research Fellow in Urbanism at the Sydney School of Architecture, Design and Planning. And her research interests are at the intersection between urban planning, transport, and human health. So when Melody essentially introduced those 3 key components, there's the physical environment, there's the social environment, and there's the information environment. Jennifer's very much going to help us with the physical environment side of things. So we'll welcome Jennifer Kent to join us. And Daniel, you've heard about Daniel. Daniel, your PhD has been submitted quite recently, hasn't it? So we should congratulate you on that. So Daniel Surkalim, Research Officer in the University of Sydney's Prevention Research Centre. He's also a consultant for the World Health Organization, and his research looks at, as you've heard, the behavioural epidemiological interactions. So he's dealing more with the social, the physical, and we'll come back, I think, to the informational in our discussion. So Daniel, please join me as well. So I think our job now is to reflect upon what Melody said and told us, and I think parsing it in those 3 ways is a really good place to start. The other thing I really enjoyed, I thought, was the use of hungry, thirsty, and lonely as adaptive responses to meeting those fundamental needs, a social need, and 2 physical needs. So those themes, I think, were really pervasive. So I wonder, Jennifer, would you like to give us your reflections in terms of your research, and particularly your work with the Matilda Centre and showing the significance of physical environment on loneliness?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Stephen. Such a wonderful talk, Melody. Thank you. So in terms of the built environment, I suppose when we think about ways to avoid long-term experiences of loneliness, we think about the different interactions that we can have. In the built environment, we're particularly interested in incidental social interactions. So those little nods that you might give to somebody while you're riding past on your bike, or providing people with a space to just sit and be so that they can feel like they're involved and belong in a community. And there are plenty of things that we as urban planners can do to provide those environments, providing public open spaces that are safe, that are well maintained, that are welcoming, that are green, are the kinds of things we need to do to get people out of their private cars, out of their private homes, and into the environment around them, having those micro-social interactions, incidental interactions. I think an interesting part of the research in this space, though, is that to not feel lonely, we also need to be able to feel like we can have time out. So we don't want to feel like we are constantly bombarded with having to have interactions. And I'm particularly interested in that in the context that more and more of us are living in higher density built environments. And it's so important that we're providing people with the opportunity to take time out in those environments. Because if they can't take time out, if they always feel like they're being surveilled, if they always feel like they're surrounded by people, then they're not going to want to go out and voluntarily interact with people. Their interaction budgets are going to be sapped up in those less positive experiences. So I think there is a lot that the built environment can do, but it is 2 sides of the coin, if you like.
And that distinction between giving you the opportunity to avoid one another as well as to come together is such an interesting one. Yeah, and living, you can be lonely in a crowd, and you can be overly socially stimulated in a crowd as well. So
absolutely. And I think that's one of the things we always say, you can be alone but not lonely.
Yeah.
And I also think it's interesting in the context of my work on private car use and attachments to private car use. What I've found is that a lot of people use their private car to get that sense of time out, because in the rest of their lives, they are so on show. They're working in shared offices, they're living in higher densities, they're going to parks that are just overcrowded. So using the private car as a space for time out comes very naturally. And that, to me, is a really systemic problem with the way that we're planning our built environments at the moment.
That's really interesting. So that's the physical environment. So Daniel, tell us your reflections, further reflections in relation to the issue of connectedness, the social connectedness.
Yeah, definitely. Just to build on Jennifer's point there, it's this idea, especially in loneliness research. Historically, we've always put loneliness and social isolation together. There's always been that conflation of terms, and that's not necessarily the case. Melody touched upon it earlier, but loneliness is this experience or this feeling that we get when our expected number of social connections or the quality of social connections that we have do not meet the expectations that we have. So if you expect to have 500 close friends and you only have 300, I see people laughing, 500 is a lot. Let's say you expect 50 close friends and you only have 30, then that discrepancy between how many social connections you actually have versus how many you expect, that's going to result in loneliness. However, social isolation is a more objective concept. It's how many social connections or interactions that you have. And that's a point that we touched upon just before, is this idea that it's all about expectations. If you don't expect to have a lot of social interactions and social connections, then you're not going to get lonely. It's when you have those high expectations, that's when loneliness kind of develops. So it's this idea that Stephen touched upon, you can be in a crowd like this room and still feel lonely because you don't feel connected to anyone here. Or you could be completely by yourself in your room, and if you have zero expectations of social connection, you're not going to feel lonely from that perspective. So, I mean, I shouldn't be saying this as a loneliness researcher, but the pandemic and working from home, I did not mind that. Kind of what Jennifer was talking about, sometimes being in an office and being around everyone, having to be on all the time, that can kind of drain your social battery a little bit. So if you have less expectations or lower expectations, I guess it's hard to get more disappointed.
So what sets those expectations?
That is a subjective thing. I think it comes down to your own kind of values and what you specifically desire. And this is where I think technology plays a very integral role, especially social media, where we are seeing the best of what people want to present to us. People see other people at parties or having good relationships, or this is the idealized version of what they have, and that changes people's expectations of what they want in their lives. And if you're not meeting that, then that's where this disappointment and this mismatch and this loneliness kind of comes up a little bit.
So that brings us into the information realm as well. But I wonder, before we leave that, the issue of personality, do you think sort of differences in people are inherent, biologically inherent, or determined by prior experiences? So your expectation has some mapping back to your type of personality. Is there good evidence for that? It seems sort of intuitive.
There is evidence regarding your own kind of personal, I guess, your personality, and that is made up of your social context and the environment that you were brought up in. We also see during research there are certain countries or certain cultures that are more either, let's say male or masculine or male dominated, where these expectations are kind of instilled upon you from a younger age. And so those cultures tend to be a little bit more reserved, less open to kind of this mental and this social aspect, and that kind of manifests in itself. But then you have either more kind of individualistic cultures. You have others that are more social cultures, and all these definitely play a part to who you are and your expectations. So the tricky thing of loneliness is, because it is so subjective, there's really no one-size-fits-all solution. And someone, I did an interview the other week, and someone asked me, do I think it's possible to completely eliminate loneliness? And no, I don't think so, because it is so personal to you that there is no magic pill that you can take to make people not lonely anymore. And I don't think that that should be the goal as well. Like Melody mentioned, loneliness is akin to hunger and thirst. It's a trigger within you to say, something's wrong, I should go and make some social connections. So I don't think necessarily eliminating loneliness altogether is possible or should be what is warranted. I think we should be aiming to reduce problematic and prolonged loneliness. But loneliness itself is so unique to the person that I don't think there is a feasible one-size-fits-all treatment.
So, Melody, do you think we've over-medicalized it? It sounds like we might.
I think that traditionally too much attention has been paid to the individuals. I mean, there are aspects of the loneliness is maladaptive thinking, to change your way of thinking. I mean, reflecting on myself, that the idea of having a spotlight over me, kind of being watched and being hypervigilant about social threat, that is something that can probably be improved through counseling with a psychologist or something like that. But again, like what I emphasized in the talk, I felt that way because the environment didn't make me feel a sense of belonging, because the environment didn't make it easy for me to socialize with others. So I think that this conversation is still quite recent, because traditionally loneliness has been more discussed in the field of psychology, and it's very recent in public health. And that's why I think that we have to take a public health approach that is more about the upstream solutions, to seek for the environment for the answers. I think that is really the next stage of how we talk and, tackle loneliness. I'm not going to use the word treat.
Well, I guess that brings us to solutions. So, Jennifer, what would you, from your perspective, advise if we were to have some influence over urban design, urban planning? What would you, in your ideal world, do?
Sure. First of all, be really careful about density. Don't just pursue density at all costs. We need to factor in the need to provide green open space, infrastructure, places for people to actually be and meet each other. And we need to maintain those things. They can't be just sold off to a developer. Second of all, I think we do need to think about the way that we are travelling around our cities. Loneliness is very much correlated with car-dependent societies, and that's for all sorts of reasons. But we know that people who are out and about walking for transport, cycling for transport, using public transport are more likely to have those micro interactions that I was talking about, actually walking through your suburb rather than just driving through it. I think that we don't pay enough attention to the way that we design our public open spaces to ensure that they're accessible and appealing to the broad nature of the community, that we are responding to what the community actually wants. And I suppose my final recommendation, and this is just a bit of a personal one, a very small subset of the problem. We need to be able to ensure that people can keep companion animals in our cities as they densify. Companion animals are very much associated with good health outcomes when managed properly. If we're building out the infrastructure for people to be able to keep dogs and cats, if we're not providing dog parks, if we're not allowing people to travel with their pets on public transport, if we're not allowing people to keep a cat in their apartment, then we're really taking away what could be a very, very nice and easy way to attenuate feelings of loneliness. That's a personal one, though.
I love it.
I support that, yeah. As the dad of a small Cocker Spaniel, I support that.
Oh.
Melody, what would you recommend?
I think I want more conversations like this. I think there needs to be more public discussion about loneliness for, whether it's something like this or whether it's having prominent people sharing their loneliness experience. I think we need to humanize loneliness. We still have a lot of destigmatizing to do. And I think really like what I was trying so hard to come across in my talk is, really loneliness can take different shapes and sizes. It can really wax and wane throughout our life, and just be aware of that and not make assumptions. That person's always very social, he must be okay. And that person is very quiet, so there must be some problem going on. And we need to be aware, be compassionate, be sensitive, but also just knowing that is a very individual experience. So for me, I really want more conversations and more awareness raising. I want us to live in a society where, when one particular man, let's say, can reach out to others and say, hey, I'm feeling lonely lately, can we chat? I want to live in a society where that is a sign of strength, not a sign of weakness.
That's very good. And picking up, there's one other thing that was striking from the data you showed, and that was increased risk with age, particularly. And when that's coupled with the breakdown of family units, or at least the dispersion of family units, do you think is there data to indicate that that's really fundamentally part of that increased risk with age?
That has been traditionally seen as the case, but again, as we have seen around the world, that the experience could be very different. So just because that our risk might increase when we get older doesn't mean that there's no solutions around it. I think that that again tied together with ageism in many ways. Yeah. How do we build a society? How do we build our entire environment to be friendly towards everybody, especially the vulnerable ones, whether that's defined by age, loneliness experience, or disability?
Absolutely, thank you. And Daniel, your final thoughts. What do you think?
I think addressing loneliness is a systemic issue. I think we have to, I'm going to go one step higher than environmental here, Jennifer, but I'm going to say we have to work on a policy level as well. We have to establish, I guess, better policies regarding how we treat loneliness throughout, but also how we research loneliness. What we find in the research is even when just measuring loneliness, there's so many different tools that are currently being used that they just provide really non-comparable measures. So really having some sort of standard way to start monitoring and surveilling, carrying surveillance for loneliness overall, but also even just investing more resources in the academics and the researchers and the crowd will, I hope, appeal to this, but also you guys understand that money is always welcome when it comes to research. So, more investments and more resources and time and attention invested into not only research, but also things like the built environment, things like creating these spaces where people are able to seek out connections should they require it.
Yeah, and I was particularly struck by this observation that it's a relative thing. So you need to measure it relative to the baseline, and that's variable from individual to individual. And that methodology seems to be an area of real need, doesn't it? And well, look, I think we've chatted to one another for long enough, and it's probably time now to open the conversation to the audience. I have the good fortune to see a whole list of questions in front of me. I'm not sure if they're up there. No, good. And these are the most popular questions according to Slido, and I'm going to ask them from the top. So our first question is from Claire. Is Claire in the audience? Hey, there you go. So we'll rush over with a microphone for Claire. Thank you. Well, I shall if you like.
That's fine. It's okay. So the question was, the world's really obsessed with AI and online connectivity and things like that at the moment. It's like, so in roles like yours, what do you see as the really important things we can do to reestablish the fundamentals of the super important things like human connection and people talking, even like physical touch and the positive impact that has on people's well-being? Like, how do we keep that with so much momentum behind it, even though the AI is the important, sexy thing that people want to hear about today?
Yeah, totally. We predicted that one, didn't we? So who'd like to pick up the AI question? Melody, I think you should.
Oh, I think I'm going to make a general comment about social media, because AI is a bit too new for us to have any research data we can refer to. But in terms of social media, I think some of that answer might actually apply to AI as well. And it's not as what we think that those who use more social media are more lonely or less lonely or vice versa. It's actually a lot more complex. So the data really show that it's actually more about how you use social media rather than the frequency time you spend on social media. I think, how do we create that virtual environment to facilitate real connections rather than replacing existing in human context? So I guess that's a very broad answer to your question.
I guess this could be it's not evidence-based, it's just something that I would presume, having seen lots of stuff in the media, but the idea that social connection, particularly amongst adolescents, can be too much. It can be too much in that the expectations are set too high, there's no downtime, etc. Is there any research on the impacts on loneliness imposed by excessive interaction through social media?
I think.
Nothing comes off the top of my head, but it seems like a good idea for the next paper.
Seems important, right? Good.
Can I add something in there? I mean, one of the things that sociologists are very concerned about with the use of social media and AI, I think, ties into this, is that social media creates like an echo chamber of our own ideas. It really dilutes the diversity of the connections that we have. And that's where the built environment can step in, because when you're out and about in the environment, you're bumping into people who are very different from you. And that diversity of connection is just so important, not only for combating experiences of loneliness, but also giving you an appreciation for the diversity in the world. When you have that diversity, you feel less afraid to go and connect with somebody who is not exactly like you. So that's what concerns me about AI and this taking ourselves out of the, I want to say natural built environment, but the natural environment around us, because we're taking away that diversity. And that's worrying, I think.
I think I'm going to add on a little bit that because Jennifer just mentioned the kind of things that we tend to see on social medias are very filtered, curated, and then because loneliness is defined as your ideal social relationship and the reality, what you see, especially for young people who don't have the ability to distinguish what is, the filtered reality and what is the real reality, it might set the expectation to be very unrealistic. Look at all the people around me. They're so popular. They have so many friends. Their posts are constantly being liked. They're always gorgeous, surrounded by cool friends. So I think, that probably gets back to what I said about what you use the social media for and how you use it. If the social media is used for, really, really excruciating upward comparison when it comes to social life, then it is inevitably going to make you feel more lonely.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think playing devil's advocate here for AI, I think it presents a very unique and new opportunity. And I think the newness of AI itself actually presents a very interesting point in which we can intervene on that policy level, where I guess with social media, where it's been so embedded in our lives, it's a lot harder to impose a lot of these kind of terms and policies that change the way that people interact with social media, just because people don't like change or people don't like things being taken away from them. But with AI still being kind of this new field that we're all kind of traversing, this is, I guess, the key time where we should be instilling these policies in regards to data transparency, in regards to how we use it, in regards to how companies use it, and really kind of setting that up from really setting that up from the get-go, just to make sure that the way that we progress with AI, because it is happening, it's not something that we can completely avoid. It's always going to happen. Any people here who teach know that AI and plagiarism has been a very big issue, and how do we kind of circumnavigate that, and we're still learning. Same thing here. We should be looking at ways to kind of monitor and track it so that we're not playing catch-up 20 years from now, where AI has exploded into an even bigger thing.
So our new source of anxiety is, am I having a social interaction with a person or not? Yes. Okay, so is John in the room? I'll leave you to ask your question, John.
Hi, Melanie, thanks for that great presentation. I'm just kind of curious about, is there a relationship between loneliness and sort of some of the new modern ways of working, like the being remote working or hybrid types of working, where for a lot of people, that workplace is where you get a lot of that relationship and you build a lot of that, but now we are isolating groups of people to working from home. Has there been any research on that?
Great question.
Do any of you know any research on that?
We did do a review of some of the health impacts of working from home. It was in the context of transport. But it was one of the things that came up consistently, that people were feeling more isolated from their work colleagues. But then there's also research suggests that people, when they're working from home, are more likely to interact and socialise in their local environment. So this sort of draw of the local that we all experienced during COVID, where we were discovering parks that we never knew existed, etc., I think working from home has the ability to perhaps perpetuate that slightly.
Yeah, I think that's quite, it's quite similar to how I feel. I haven't read the paper, but just definitionally, when we're working in the office, or versus not being physically in the office. It's more touching on the social isolation issue. It's more objectively about whether you're surrounded by people or not. And loneliness is a different thing. When you have a choice to work from home versus coming into the office, not like during the lockdown that nobody is allowed to come into the office, I think that's a different thing as well. Because when you have the choice, you know when to come back to the office for social connections, like thirst and hunger, right? And we also can use our time that we save from our commuting for things that we value more. That could be, you know, spending more time with friends and family.
Yes, and I think it's interesting, isn't it, that the data that do exist are to do with productivity rather than loneliness or aspects to do with mental health. Yeah, that's telling in its own way. Now, there's lots of anonymouses, so it's very hard to get. Whoever's called anonymous has asked an inordinate number of questions. So there's several of them around that theme, around working from home. We've talked about social media and loneliness. I think that's well covered. There's a question about how do we ease loneliness in aged care homes, and I think we did touch upon that a little bit, didn't we, in relation to age and isolation with age. So we probably have... oh no, it's gone. That was a good question. It was, is lack of sex in your later years of marriage after 21 years of marriage? Very specific, anonymous.
I have never researched that. Have you researched that?
Does that lead to the feeling of disconnect and loneliness?
Well.
Question. Oh, look, that seems to me to be a leading question, and we won't go there.
You guys can talk about that after.
So we'll have, I think we should have one more question. I am just mindful of the time. Hand at the back, yes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. We talk a lot about the bad side of the loneliness. My question is for Daniel. During your research, do you have see any good side of the loneliness? Because I remember my mom always tell me when I was a teenager, say, oh, great people always can practice themselves in the loneliness. And same as Melody's example, when you're hungry, you eat, but sometimes you want fast, right? You want to hold on a little bit, then you go to eat. Maybe it's good for your health. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, really interesting question. Thank you. I think when we speak about loneliness, we tend to view it and frame it in a deficit-based model. Where we think of loneliness, we think it's a negative thing. And the antithesis of loneliness is social connection. And when we talk to someone about social connection, the connotations between the two topics tend to differ. If I was to talk to people and say, how do we deal with loneliness, as opposed to how do we increase social connection, you will have two very separate paths in terms of treatment, interventions, the way that you think. So loneliness in itself is, I guess, in that capacity is a very pathologized way. I think what you're referring to more is about levels of social connection that an individual is after. And because loneliness is so subjective, it tends to vary because it's a very fluid thing. It's not necessarily a dichotomous, yes, you're lonely as a person, or no, you're not. You can become lonelier, quote unquote, or less lonely over time, and that could fluctuate. In that capacity where you kind of mentioned people choose to kind of withdraw themselves, or they kind of like do that, that's coming down to, again, those expectations that people might have, right? If at this very moment, I don't feel like connecting with anyone, then that's me feeling less lonely, and that's me choosing to withdraw myself a little bit more. If in this moment I expect more, or I'm craving more connection, and then I'm more lonely, and therefore I go and look for connection in that capacity. So I think it looks different for people. There's definitely people who, again, have various, you can talk about introvertedness and extrovertedness, and people who thrive better by themselves, or people who thrive better in the space of others. But I think it comes down to, I guess, again, those expectations for social connection that you have, and knowing that that might change for a person. Just because you want to be in an environment where you're surrounded by a lot of people today does not mean they'll be the same tomorrow. And that will also differ on the context that you're working with. If you are trying to get something done for a deadline, you're probably not going to be wanting to be surrounded by a lot of people. You want to be more reserved in that capacity. So I think just being aware of the fluctuations in how you're feeling and expectations regarding that.
I do like the idea of, instead of fasting, social restriction as an imposed, like a fasting regime. And we have been, I'm pleased we weren't quite totally speciesist. We talked about dogs and cats, but I think as a final reflection, time in the natural environment, there was a question submitted prior to the evening about time in nature and on your own in nature, but therefore as a curative in respect of loneliness. And I want a final word on that, and then I think I need my cue cards for the final thing at the end of the evening. They were on the chair over there and they've disappeared, but here they come. So yes, the natural environment, I guess that's crucial to urban
absolutely.
design.
I'm just hoping that I'm not about to cough all over everybody. We find that access to nature is just so important. And it's really interesting to think about why that's the case. Of course, there's all the obvious stuff, like it cleans our air and that kind of thing. But one point that I'm really interested in is that it takes away the predictability of the built environment. So when you think about a concrete environment, everything is predictable. All of the lines and so forth are predictable. But when you look at a leaf or a tree or a plant, it's unpredictable. And something about that changes the way we look at it. And it's almost like a micro practice of mindfulness that we get from being in that environment, where we're able to, for one moment, let our mind wander off into something that is less predictable and get out of ourselves. So if we take out those elements of greenery, or if we fashion them such that they're just tiny pocket parks that are again curated and very predictable, then we're really denying ourselves that opportunity. And companion animals and other animals in nature are similar. Birds, for example, they liven up our built environment, and how amazing that they have survived what we've done to them. So we need to provide built environments that support natural elements, flora, fauna, the whole thing. It's so important.
Take up sewing and become a biologist. There's that. So look, on that note, I think we should thank Jennifer and Melody and Daniel for a wonderful evening. And firstly, we'll applaud you all, so thank you. And of course, thank you to you, the audience, physical audience and our online audience. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Join us for the next Sydney Ideas event with a prominent anthropologist and geographer, and really extraordinary First Nations educator as well, Marsha Langton. Marsha's going to give a keynote about the Indigenous voice to Parliament. Join that conversation on Thursday, the 3rd of August, here on campus. That's going to be down the road at the Home Building on Science Road, and it also will be live streamed and recorded, and you can get the details on the Sydney Ideas website. So this has been Sydney Ideas here at the Charles Perkins Centre. I'm Steve Simpson. Thank you and good night.